Hi, I'm Josh Wright, Executive Director of the Global Antitrust Institute, and welcome to the GAI online lecture series. Today I'm going to introduce the concept of unilateral effects in merger analysis. Today we're going to cover theories of harm under which post-merger firm incentives change. One way to think about post-merger incentives changing is that the merger creates an incentive, ownership of the new firm creates an incentive to increase prices as a result of the merger. Another way to think about post-merger pricing incentives are that acquisition of the new firm gives an incentive we call downward pricing pressure as a result of cost savings or other forms of efficiencies for post-merger prices to decrease. So we're going to think in terms of economics 101, really. We're going to think about the profit maximization problem that a firm faces, how a merger changes that problem in two ways and often simultaneously. In one way, we'll think about the merger increasing the price or increasing incentives to raise the price. And another way, we'll think about ways in which acquisition of a new firm through a merger can result in post-merger prices that are lower. There are a couple of things to lay out in terms of nomenclature here in the beginning. One is this sort of unilateral effects versus coordinated effects nomenclature. You'll see the language in the horizontal merger guidelines in the US and elsewhere. And really, we're talking about two concepts that are distinct in some ways, but have some interplay as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the lecture. So, unilateral effects refer in general to the idea that a merged firm has an incentive to increase the price because of the merger without any help from rivals, right? So think about merger to monopoly as the simple story. Two firms merged to one. They were facing some competitive constraint before the merger from each other. As a result of the merger, they can increase the market price, reduce the market output. That's what we think of as a unilateral pricing effect. The firm has the power on its own to impact market conditions as a result of the merger. Coordinated effects, and we'll cover this in another presentation, so we won't talk about it much today. So just in a way of contrast, coordinated effects refer to the concept that the merger still impacts the incentives for firms to increase price after the merger, but in a different way. It's really a different story about post-merger incentives. And the story in coordinated effects is that it increases the incentive to coordinate with rivals in order to increase the price. That coordination might be express collusion that's already unlawful under most antitrust laws. It could be something more tacit or even just the accommodation of competition or accommodation of a price increase post-merger by rivals. But the coordinated effects concept by definition involves some form of accommodation or coordination with rivals in order to effectuate the price increase, whereas unilateral effects refer to the post-merger incentive and ability of the firm to raise price all by itself. The line between the two can get fuzzy in some nuanced cases. Today, we're just going to introduce the concepts and how we think about them in economics. In both cases, I want you to distinguish both unilateral effects and coordinated effects from what we might describe as the structural approach to thinking about mergers. So in the older approach to thinking about the economics of mergers, and it's still embedded in the horizontal merger guidelines in some places, and in the US, certainly in some case law out of the 60s, think Brown Shoe and Vaughn's Grocery, Pabst Brewing, and the like, and even through P&B and the structural presumption, is the idea that we can infer the likelihood of post-merger price increases simply by looking at market shares or the number of firms in the market. So 4-3 or a 5-4 or a 6-5, the way we may talk about mergers in a casual sense by counting up the number of firms with our fingers and then making inferences about the post-merger prices. There's something importantly different about unilateral and coordinated effects, and you'll see as we go through and make some examples. Both unilateral effects and coordinated effects are specific to this merger, and really the modern economic approach is really focused in on why this particular acquisition changes post-merger incentives, either to increase price or, as we'll see, to decrease price. The structural approach is more generic. It doesn't matter which of the two firms in a market are merging. It's that the merger is 5-4, 4-3, or 3-2 from where our inference for competitive effects comes. That's not the way that unilateral and coordinated effects work in modern application, where we're really talking about not the shares of the firms, but the competitive constraint imposed by the acquired firm, and how eliminating that competitive constraint through acquisition changes the specific pricing incentives of the acquiring firm. It's more specific, it's more tied to the profit maximization problem in sort of Econ 101, and we'll talk about that in some detail as well. And the same on the efficiencies front. So it's going to require us to roll up some sleeves and so our sleeves and sort of figure out some facts about the particular transaction rather than just doing market share and making some sort of general proclamations about the relationship between market structure or share and price. That view in vogue in antitrust economics in the 40s, 50s, and 60s sort of passed by in the 70s, and both agencies and industrial organization economics have been doing something much different since about the 1980s. Started thinking differently about unilateral effects in particular in the 1992 guidelines, and we'll see what the 2010 guidelines say and try to build up some tools for thinking about unilateral effects in its analysis. You can think about where we're going in the lectures. Really, both of the things you see on this graph in front of you, it's labeled Williamson Tradeoffs. Oliver Williamson in 1968 writes a paper and wins the Nobel Prize for this, among other things, but really is a simple concept. So Oliver Williamson spent some time visiting the DOJ in the 60s, the era in which these structural cases are being brought. And the Supreme Court says after Vaughn's Grocery, the Vaughn's Grocery decision, Justice Potter Stewart says in dissent, the only thing I can see consistent in the Section 7 Clayton Act cases are that the government always wins. And academics, both in industrial organization economics and antitrust law, are starting to think about why that is and sort of rethinking our approach. Now, Williamson comes along in 1968 and says, well, we should really be thinking about two different things that could be happening with a merger. The one we already know, maybe the merger gives monopoly power to the firm, right? We eliminate a competitive constraint and it's able to reduce market output and raise market price. So price goes from PC to PM and the market quantity goes from QC to QM. And we get the deadweight loss that we all sort of know and associate with monopoly pricing. If you'd like a primer or refresher on models of competition and monopoly, we have in the online lecture series some videos that you can reference or refresh your recollection. But the second thing that might be going on is that a merger might result in marginal cost savings or some other form of efficiency. So you see sort of a graph trying to do a lot of things at once in two dimensions there. So you have to use your imagination, but I might have a merger that does two things at once, right? It creates some market power on the one hand, it also results in a marginal cost reduction on the other. And you see my triangle and my rectangle. So we've got a bunch of analytical tools in antitrust economics that are implemented into the guidelines, and in some cases into antitrust doctrine itself, that are aimed sort of at diagnosing both the triangle and the rectangle, right? So in unilateral effects, we'll be focusing in on that triangle. You can think about some of our unilateral effects analysis as asking the question, when is it likely that this transaction, the one we are either reviewing at the agency or is in front of us at the court or we are defending in front of the agency, when does this transaction result in post-merger incentives to increase price and reduce output? If we had some diagnostic tools that enabled us to identify the set of mergers for which that's a plausible concern, this would be a really good thing, right? We could spend our resources analyzing those. We could quickly dismiss the rest of them. And you can think about some of this quick diagnostics as being what we used to do with market shares, right? Now, the other set of diagnostic tools we might want are to identify the subset of mergers for which this rectangle is going to be a big part of the transaction, right? And we've got easy cases that are all rectangle, no triangle, meaning all marginal cost reduction or all efficiencies and sort of no real story of competitive harm. You've got mergers that are easy to analyze in the sense that we've got all triangle, no rectangle, clear incentives to raise price, no real marginal cost efficiencies to speak of. And then you're going to have the hard cases, right? You're going to have the hard cases that are going to involve both triangle and rectangle, and we're going to need some tools at that point to measure magnitudes. But if you were building a sort of a merger system from scratch and wanted to know what sort of economic tools you would need to do it right, or minimize error cost, and sort of create the best rate of return for consumers as the beneficiaries of your antitrust institutions, well, it's really the tools that you need in your toolkit. Antitrust comes from a place where our toolkit used to be 50 years ago or so. The triangle toolkit was largely based on using our fingers. The 2010 guidelines, and as far back as the 1992 guidelines, we do a little bit better on that front, especially with respect to unilateral effects. And that's really what we'll spend the bulk of our time talking about today. And we'll spend a little bit of time introducing the idea of efficiencies as a unilateral effect as well. Acquisition of a new firm may result in post-merger incentives to lower the price, right? So it's really the flip side of the same unilateral effects coin. And we'll talk about that as well. The basic point of that Williamson trade-off is that mergers are going to involve this weighing process of upward pricing pressure on the one hand, the triangle side of the Williamson diagram, against that rectangle side. Okay? And this Williamson diagram ends up being really, in some ways, it's more than 50 years old, but at a basic level, sort of a foundational piece upon which modern merger analysis is built. Notice just with triangles and rectangles, cooked in there is an assumption that we're doing total welfare. Now, we can talk about converting that total welfare analysis to a consumer surplus standard. We can talk about how much of that rectangle in terms of marginal cost savings to the firm are ultimately passed on to consumers. And we'll talk about that at the end of the lecture as well. So the modern approach is going to be distinguished from that Williamson structural approach and the sort of older approach where we counted up the number of fingers with our firms or made inferences from market share in order to predict post-merger pricing. Is what we're going to try to do is talk more specifically about the incentives of the acquiring and acquired firm. You'll notice one of the things that's missing when we start counting firms with our fingers and doing structural antitrust is we're really not distinguishing one firm from another. If a merger is 5-4, it doesn't really matter who the acquired firm is for the purpose of our finger math. But it might well matter for the terms of the real economics and real competition lost as a result of the merger. What's missing, in other words, from the structural approach is that it doesn't account for the intensity or closeness of competition between two firms. Not all firms are equal. Not all 5-4s are the same. Not all 4-3s are the same. And so the modern approach is going to correctly take that into account. And we're going to see if we can't do a little bit better about predicting post-merger price increases, at least the incentive to increase price. And in later lectures, we're going to talk a little bit more about economic tools used to measure, some of the empirical and econometric tools used to measure these effects when magnitudes become important. The 2010 guidelines take a large step towards leaving the older approach behind and adopting this more modern approach. So we'll go through some of the guidelines language here, but a real helpful companion for you as we go through the unilateral effects lecture here is if you've got the horizontal merger guidelines with you to go ahead and get that section out and follow along. I'll highlight some language as we go through, but it would be a good idea, especially for those of you who are young practitioners, to get familiar with that language. And even as an exercise you can do on your own, compare the language in those 2010 guidelines to the 1992 guidelines, especially with respect to discussion of unilateral effects. You'll see in the 2010 guidelines make this clear, market definition, market shares de-emphasized with respect to unilateral effects. And you'll see as we work through some examples together, we'll work through some examples using modern diagnostic tools, and we won't talk about market shares at all. They'll still matter in some places, in particular when we end up doing coordinated effects, but just to give a sense of the analytical shift that's going on in the background. So let's go ahead and talk about unilateral effects in the horizontal merger guidelines. In my mind, and I think there might be some difference of opinion on this sort of out there in the practicing world, but in my mind, and certainly from the mergers that I saw when I served as commissioner at the FTC and on the staff, I think uh, the modern approach has led to more unilateral effects cases. Oftentimes, the FTC will be investigating both theories, or the DOJ will be investigating both theories. But in my mind, unilateral effects theories sort of supplanted coordinated effects as the primary theory that we investigate in most merger cases that end up making it sort of to a second request or beyond, or end up litigated. There are lots of flavors of unilateral effects, but the fundamental idea is that one firm is acquiring an especially close competitor, right? One that imposes a strong constraint on pre-merger prices. And so by lifting that constraint, we have a strong incentive to increase price. Now, the closest of competition can have lots of different flavors. We can be a market where there's differentiated products, but the products are really close to each other in product space. They make variants of toothpaste that are really similar to each other, or variants of soda or coffee or breakfast cereal that are really similar to each other in terms of consumer preferences. It can be geographically close together in space. It can be always first and second place in auctions against each other. Lots of different ways to be close competitors, and lots of different flavors of economic models we might use to predict post-merger prices. But the basic idea for most unilateral effects cases is going to be the acquired firm was a really, really tough competitive constraint on the acquiring firm's pre-merger prices, and now that constraint is going to be lifted and eliminated, making able the post-merger firm to raise prices. Okay, that's going to be the theory. Looking at the incentives to create that triangle that we talked about earlier, and ignoring the rectangle for now. So I want to keep that in mind. Most of the time when we're talking about these diagnostic tools for unilateral effects, we're thinking about holding the rectangle constant, ignore it for now. Is this the merger that has a plausible story for a reduction in market output and an increase in the market price? So the horizontal merger guidelines themselves say we think about unilateral price effects being more likely. They're greater the more the buyers of products sold by one merging firm consider products sold by the other merging firm to be their next choice, right? So this is where consumers view the merging parties as selling the sort of closest substitutes. We can get unilateral effect stories where they're not the absolute first and second best choice, right? But just to sort of give you the concept, right? The acquired firm, a strong competitive constraint on pre-merger pricing of the acquiring firm. And we're lifting that constraint and asking the post-merger firm to optimize, to profit maximize again in setting the price. And because we've lifted that constraint, the post-merger profit maxing price is higher, all things equal. We know all things won't be equal. There's going to be entry, there's going to be efficiencies, and so we'll sort of come to that part of the analysis later, but we're just focusing in on that triangle for now. Some of you really don't like math, and so you should look at the left part of the slide. You either have to like shapes or math here. You got to choose one of the two, right? But if you like algebra, you can look at the right-hand side. Here's what I want you to sort of think about in terms of the basic economics of unilateral effects. And we'll focus on the picture first, okay? So if we focus on the picture, think about that point on the demand curve, P0, Q0, right? If we set the price at P0, and you can imagine that's $5 for my cup of coffee, and Q0 is Starbucks selling coffee at $5 and selling 100 lattes, right? That's our pre-merger pricing. And if I was to ask you and put you in the position of being the manager at Starbucks, and I said, should we raise price from P0 to P1? So, P1 can be a 5% increase in price from $5 to $5.25, and ask you, is that a good idea? Is it a good idea to raise the price? What are the benefits and costs of raising the price? Is what I want you to think about. And this will be a useful economic logic to think about on market definition, competitive effects, monopolization, wherever. What's the trade-off facing a firm when it increases the price? So for the benefit, think about that horizontal, lightly blue shaded rectangle on the slide. Okay. The benefit is we're going to change the price from P0 to P1. Notice I've got a horizontal marginal cost of C there, right? So my Starbucks is making, 5 minus the marginal cost C for each, the margin on each unit. And when I raise the price that extra 25 cents for term P naught to P1, I'm making 25 cents extra margin, right? So that horizontal sliver there, that light blue sliver, is the benefit of the price increase. I'm going to make, why do I increase the price? I make a bigger margin on the units that I keep and that I sell, right? What about in that shaded area will be the extra profit that I make associated with that increase in the margin. What about the cost of the price increase? Well, the cost and pricing of the price increase is going to be that darker blue, sort of vertically oriented rectangle. I used to make P naught minus C. That was my margin on all these units I sold. Well, what happens when I raise the price? Demand curve sloped downward. I sell fewer units. I went from Q0 to Q1. Maybe I sold 100 lattes before, and now I sell 90. So I lose my old margin, P naught minus C, on that Q1 minus Q0 units, right? And so that vertical sliver is going to be the cost. Well, when should I increase the price? Well, when the benefits exceed the cost, right? So when that horizontal rectangle is bigger than the vertical, I should go ahead and increase the price. Okay? When the vertical is greater than the horizontal, I should reduce the price. And when they're just equal, that means I'm sort of profit maximizing. You can prove that to yourself on the right hand of the screen, that if I'm setting the benefit equal to the cost, I'm profit maximizing. And you'll see at the bottom there, we get this sort of core economics 101 intermediate micro relationship. That profit maximization gives us sort of just the fact that the firms are profit maximizing gives us this nice relationship between the profit margin and the elasticity of demand. We're going to come back to that later. You'll see it used in market definition a little bit and in critical loss analysis. So we'll sort of keep that in a box for a reason. We don't really need it for right now. But what I want you to think about is profit maximization through the lens of those rectangles and what happens when firm A acquires firm B to those rectangles, right? So Starbucks acquires the COSI across the street that is a close geographic competitor in the coffee market, right? What happens when we have a firm acquire a close competitor that's a sort of pre-merger pricing constraint, right? So you can ignore the numbers or look at them if you like, but the key concept is what happens is that vertical rectangle changes, right? So I want you to think about what happens when Starbucks raises the price, right? When Starbucks raises the price, it gets the extra profit margin from the increase in the margin. And that vertical rectangle represented lost sales, right? So when Starbucks raised the price, you can go back one here. That vertical rectangle was sales lost and profits associated with those sales. Some of the Starbucks lost sales went to COSI, some went to Caribou Coffee, some went to drink tea, some 4 went to all of that to drink faculty coffee in the faculty lounge. Okay, all of the lost sales are sort of right there in that vertical sliver. Well, what happens when Starbucks purchases COSI? Well, those COSI sales right now are lost profits to Starbucks. They're in that vertical rectangle. Post-merger, they're not. Starbucks gets to reach out and grab those COSI sales and sort of bring them back. You can think about Starbucks now having 2 pockets. Its left pocket is its Starbucks profits, and its right pocket is where it puts its COSI money, right? And that when it raised the price, let's say it lost 10 sales and they went all over the place in the market, but 3 of them went to COSI. Well, when I merged with COSI, those 3 sales at whatever margin they were making, $3 a sale, there's $9 out there that used to be lost profits to Starbucks that because of the merger, it's able to reach out, grab, internalize, we'll call it, and put it inside that COSI's pocket, right? So you'll hear a couple of terms and you'll see them when we go through horizontal merger guidelines language. Sometimes this is called recaptured diversion, right? Sometimes it's called recaptured diversion. Sometimes we'll talk about internalizing diverted sales, meaning the new firm is going to internalize rather than externalize those 3 sales to the market. It's going to internalize the lost profit associated with those sales and sort of recapture it. Post-merger, what happened to Starbucks benefit cost analysis? Well, now the gains from the price increase are everything in that horizontal rectangle, plus it's going to make that sliver, those recaptured diverted sales that were going to COSI, that were lost sales yesterday, they went on the cost side of the ledger yesterday. We announced the merger. Today, what happens? We raise the price. That $9 of lost sales, or however much it is, we recapture. It becomes a gain. We've moved it from the loss column to the gain column. A price increase that was unprofitable pre-merger is now profitable post-merger. That's essentially the logic of unilateral effects. And we can think of, and you'll see in some real examples and other lectures, we can think of other ways in which competitors are close and a merger might allow for recapture of diverted sales. Okay, but this is sort of the simple version. Let's get a little bit more technical and talk about what's in the guidelines and some of the terminology used. So one of the things that we use to think about how close firms are in terms of competition, and you should already sort of got a little bit that the theme here is our ability to think about unilateral effects depends on measuring closeness of competition. That's really sort of the core idea, is it depends on measuring the closeness of competition. We want not to think about all the firms in the market as homogeneous blobs, right? Coke and Pepsi might be closer competitors than Coke and Sprite, even if they're in the same market, or Coca-Cola and water, or orange juice, or something, right? We want to account for that closeness of competition. The structural approach doesn't really accommodate that. The reason we want to accommodate that concept of closeness of competition is we think that closer competitors impose a greater pre-merger pricing constraint. So diversion ratios are one way that we'll do this. Now I've got the sort of technical definition up, so the percentage of unit sales lost by product one when its price rises that are captured by product two. We sort of just did it in the COSI and Starbucks example. When Starbucks raised its price 5%, it could have been 10%, anything you want, but when it raised its price, it lost 10 sales, and 3 of them went to COSI. So the diversion ratio between Starbucks and COSI is 30%, 3 over 10, right? It lost 10 sales, right? We want the percentage of unit sales lost by product one when its price rises that are captured by product two. So the denominator is the lost sales responsive to a price increase. We don't want the denominator to be sales they lost for some other reason. We don't want it to be sales they lost because the product got less popular. We don't want it to be sales that Starbucks lost because entry of a new rival, or seasonal switches in demand when pumpkin spice lattes come out, right? We want it to be sales that are lost in response to a price increase, okay? And when we see that price increase, we know it lost 10 sales, 3 went to COSI, diversion ratio of 30%. Okay? We'll talk a little bit later about where diversion ratio data come from. Oftentimes firms keep this themselves, right? And this is part of what agencies investigate. Firms keep this themselves. There might be natural experiments in the data. We'll have a lecture in the online lecture series later about some empirical methods used to estimate diversion ratios to use for either market definition or competitive effects purposes. So oftentimes diversion ratio data are coming from actual consumer behavior in the market. Sometimes we're making cruder or rougher estimates. We'll talk a little bit more about methods in later lectures, but really these are our best shot at getting the best data available at thinking about consumer behavior in response to price changes. So once I've got that once I've got that diversion ratio, there's a couple things I can do with it. You remember back to our vertical rectangle and the part that was recaptured, right? That part that's recaptured is sort of the prize that the post-merger firm earns as a result of the price increase. And the larger that is, the larger the prize for the price increase. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to measure in a couple of places in the guidelines. We'll get to something called the GUPPI, the Gross Upward Pricing Pressure Index, that shows up in the horizontal merger guidelines, and we'll sort of show you how to calculate it. It's not the only way to think about unilateral effects. Sometimes we'll be able to empirically go out and measure sort of directly whether we think a price increase will happen, because there'll be entry and exit experiments in the market that let us do that. Sometimes we're moving more directly and measuring kind of indirect methods. Those indirect methods are really going to be ways of estimating how big that rectangle is. And the bigger that rectangle is, the more likely we think the post-merger firm is going to increase price to try to grab it. Right? That's fundamentally what we're getting at with the value of diverted sales. So if you look at that formula down there, it's the diversion ratio times the margin for the second firm. And that's going to be the area of that rectangle. So go back to my COSI example. My diversion ratio was 30%. So 3 out of 10 of the sales that Starbucks lost were going to COSI. Well, how much is that worth? The margin at COSI, right? So 3 sales went over there, and the margin at COSI for the lattes it sells that it grabbed from Starbucks are $3 per latte. And so our value of diverted sales in that example would be not $9. We can do it in percentage terms, right? We can do the margin, the dollar margin times 30%, right? But what we're trying to measure is the vertical part of that that sliver, that recaptured diversion. We can think about that intuitively, the value of diverted sales as being the opportunity cost of the merged firm selling an additional unit of product one, instead of increasing the price and getting that substitution over to COSI from Starbucks, right? So the larger that rectangle, that value of diverted sales, the larger the incentive to increase price. We're one step away from converting that value of diverted sales to what you'll hear economists talk about as the GUPPI, okay? So let's go to the guidelines themselves. Right? All of this language with what we've done so far should feel familiar. Adverse unilateral price effects arise when the merger gives the merged entity an incentive to raise the price of a product previously sold by one merging firm, so far so good, and thereby divert sales to products previously sold by the other merging firm. Right? I'm going to increase the Starbucks price to shift you over to COSI. I don't lose those sales anymore, right? So taking as a given other prices and product offerings, we freeze the world when we do this analysis. We're just looking at that rectangle, holding constant the ability of rivals of Starbucks and COSI to adjust to, right? The value of diverted sales to a product is equal to the number of units diverted to that product, 3 sales from Starbucks to COSI, multiplied by the margin between price and incremental cost, that $3 margin that I pulled from thin air, right? The value of diverted sales is the sales that shift from Starbucks to COSI when Starbucks raises the price times the margin for COSI. That's that rectangular sliver that's the recaptured diversion. The bigger that is, the larger the incentive to grab it through a price increase, and the bigger the incentive increase from pre-merger pricing. Okay? Now notice one problem that this faces. If you think about different products in the world, some products are sold at retail and grocery stores, sell at a margin of 1% or a penny or 5 cents or $1. And as a percentage margin, that might be big or small, right? But the sort of absolute number for the margin is small. We might think about the profit margin on a fighter jet or an expensive automobile when we measure it in dollars to be sort of a lot different. But we want to be able to talk across those product markets in useful ways to measure. Remember, we're trying to measure a strength of an incentive to increase price. We're trying to come up with a metric that does that performs better maybe than counting with our fingers. So the thing we're doing here, we want to work both in the luxury automobile market and the fighter jet market and the soda market and the market for retail products that sell at tiny, tiny margins. So we want to normalize this value of diverted sales, and we're going to do that by dividing by the price of the first product, right? We're just going to divide by the acquiring firm's product so that we can talk about this and sort of scale our measure of upward pricing pressure. So all we're going to do is take our value of diverted sales, divide by the price of the first product, and that's sort of our simple calculation. You see the formula up there: diversion ratio times the margin of the second product divided by the price of the first, and that's our gross upward pricing pressure index. It's referenced in the horizontal merger guidelines. It's a simple way using diversion and margin data to get a rough estimate of whether the incentive to raise price is strong or not. Okay. a couple of things about the use of the GUPPI as one of the ways to measure upward pricing pressure. It's not the only way. It's gross, not net, and that's important. It means we've ignored that rectangle in its entirety, right? So the triangle can be small, the rectangle can be big, there could be net incentives to lower price. That's not what the GUPPI is about. The GUPPI is not a tool to do competitive effects in its entirety. The GUPPI is a tool to diagnose the likelihood that we have an incentive to increase the price, right? So it's sort of a first cut, if you will. Now, a couple of other things about the GUPPI. You'll see fancier versions, and we'll have later an online lecture about merger simulation. There are fancier versions of trying to sort of measure how the strength of the incentives to internalize diversion result in actual prices. The GUPPI doesn't do that, right? So the GUPPI is not, and this sort of cardinal sin to avoid, number one, that I actually think is made quite a bit, including inside and outside the agency and by smart antitrust lawyers in lots of places. We run a GUPPI and we get out 15% or 20%, and you'll hear people say, post-merger prices are going to increase 15 or 20%. That's not what the GUPPI is, right? Remember, the GUPPI is estimating the value of diverted sales divided by that first price, right? It's measuring the strength of an incentive, not measuring the magnitude of a price increase. We'll need something different for that. We'll need to estimate demand, and we'll need to think about things like efficiencies and everything else to do a full competitive effects analysis, right? We won't talk about this much now, but, and this has been used at least in one litigated case that I know of, but with some really simple assumptions, linear demand in particular. It is true that you can back out some back of the envelope results that the GUPPI divided by 2 approximates the price increase. We can do the same thing efficiencies. If we've got linear demand and supply and you've got a marginal cost reduction of 10%, we know that it reduces the price 5%. So with really nicely behaved and shaped curves. Now, I wouldn't go testify using that method, but if you're just trying to rough things out, that's a helpful way just to think roughly about magnitudes. I've got a little example you can work through on your own, but you see in the example I've got, if it's not a coffee example, it's a bourbon example. So I've got Four Roses and Blanton's as 2 competitors in the bourbon market, and Four Roses are going to acquire Blanton's. And I've given you their market shares mostly as a red herring. You're going to see we don't need them at all. And you've got your information on how to, on each of their marginal cost and margins, right? So if I want to figure out the diversion ratio between Four Roses to Blanton's, I can, I've got it for you in the problem, and now I can calculate a GUPPI if I want, right? So I've got my diversion ratio between Four Roses to Blanton's. That means the diverted sales to Blanton's upon a Four Roses price increase, right? Times the margin of the Blanton's product divided by the price of Four Roses, and I get a GUPPI of 8%. We'll sort of ignore now what that 8% means. Is it high? Is it low? There was a debate among economists for a while that sort of there hasn't been sort of much advancing the ball on what GUPPIs are high and low in terms of their predictive power. When the 2010 guidelines were released, the chief economist of the DOJ, Carl Shapiro, said GUPPIs below 5 don't interest us. They're just sort of too small, and there's going to be some inevitable efficiencies. And so there's a safe harbor or something like a safe harbor below 5%. At the FTC, they sort of rejected the idea of a safe harbor. You can go and look at the dollar stores matter. I have a dissent on the topic, sort of beside the point for now. Right? Higher GUPPI means higher incentive to increase price. Remember, all things equal, not a price increase estimate. And so far, what we've done is we've assumed no efficiencies, no entry, no repositioning. So Jack Daniels and other bourbon makers and whiskey makers aren't able to reposition. We sort of called timeout on everybody else, tied their hand behind their back, and just thought about substitution between the merging firms. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about introducing the flip side for unilateral effects, and that is efficiency. So we're back to that cost savings rectangle and sort of away from deadweight loss and associated with reducing the market output and raising the market price. The merger guidelines talk about that rectangle throughout the guidelines in section 10, right? In a unilateral effects context, incremental cost reductions may reduce or reverse any increase in the merged firm's incentive to elevate price, right? So the merger guidelines themselves contemplate efficiencies and in particular incremental cost reductions as affecting the post-merger firm's incentives to price. And that makes plenty of sense. And it says the agencies won't challenge a merger if its cognizable efficiencies will offset any price increase, right? So if the efficiencies are sufficient to offset that sort of triangle, the unilateral price effect, then the agencies say they won't challenge. So what diagnostic tools do we have to think about any of this? Well, the agencies tell us that efficiencies have to be cognizable, and that means merger specific, verifiable, doesn't arise from anti-competitive reductions in output. We'll save a deeper discussion of that for later, but for usable terms now, merger specific means only accomplished with the merger, unlikely to be accomplished without the merger. But the agencies don't insist upon a less restrictive alternative that's merely theoretical, right? You can think in theory, anything I can do with a merger, maybe I could do with a complicated enough contractual agreement with the rival. The agency guidelines, at least on paper, say we don't insist upon merger specificity of that nature. What happens in practice probably requires a whole nother lecture and discussion. They've got to be verifiable rather than just speculative. We've got to be able to substantiate, okay? And doesn't arise from an anti-competitive reduction in output, right? Merging firms can't say as a result of the merger we'll compete less intensely and that'll save us a lot of money, right? There's a difference between cost savings and efficiencies in terms of antitrust analysis, right? Lots of common types of efficiencies: operational costs, lower input cost as a result of the merger. One firm really knows how to market, the other knows how to distribute. We'll sort of implement best practices across the firm, maybe transportation costs, combine R&D efforts to get greater innovation, higher quality products at lower cost, sort of no limit on the types of efficiencies that are claimed in these contexts that need to be substantiated and sort of run through our analytical framework. Okay. But I really just want to focus on a couple of key points in terms of the analytics and getting you to think through incremental savings in terms of incremental marginal cost reductions in affecting post-merger prices. That's sort of the theme for the day, right? What the guidelines say is the greater the anti-competitive effect, the larger we sort of estimate the strength of that incentive or the actual magnitude of a price increase, the greater the rectangle has to be, and the more they must be passed on to consumers for the agencies to not challenge the transaction. So let's think about what that pass-through means. I mean, that's sort of back to our ball game for the day, mergers impacting post-merger prices, right? That's really what we're focused on. So pass-through responds to how a firm's price to consumers, right? How that ultimate price change when a firm's cost changes. You'll often hear the sort of folk intuition that, well, a merger, if it eliminates competition and there's that rectangle, well, why on earth would a monopolist or a firm with market power want to pass on those savings? Don't they just sort of pocket that money? And so we're going to use a little bit of economics to think sort of a little bit more analytically about pass-through, right? But that folk intuition that because of the merger reducing competition, there's no need to pass through any of the savings is something, if you've been around antitrust for very long, you've heard, and if you haven't been around antitrust very long, you will hear soon from somewhere. Okay? So let's think about the economics. Go back to our simple, and you can sort of look back at the refresher model of monopoly in our earlier online lecture series. But we know profit maximization requires the monopolist chooses the price where MR equals MC, right? That got us our 1 over elasticity equals margin. You'll remember setting the rectangles equal to each other, but this is sort of the basic idea, right? Is that the monopolist chooses the quantity where MR equals MC. That gives us our price. What happens when we get a marginal cost reduction, right? You can think about the marginal revenue and marginal cost being sort of the good and bad news to the monopolist of producing one more output. Well, when the marginal cost falls, okay, when the marginal cost falls, the bad news associated with producing more output is less. We should expect him to increase the output and reduce the price if he's profit maximizing, right? You can see that graphically here, right? As the marginal cost falls and the monopolist profit maximizes, what's changed? Marginal revenue is the same, right? But the cost to the firm of increasing output's gone down. So when he profit maximizes after that marginal cost reduction, the new price is P2 instead of P1. The price falls not because of the benevolence of the firm with market power, right? The price falls precisely because the firm is profit maximizing. The profit maximizing thing for the firm to do yesterday when it said MR equals to MC was set a price of 1. Now it wants to increase output because the cost to the firm of increasing output has fallen, right? And so we get that sort of pass through. Now you'll notice the decrease in price is not as large as the cost reduction. With everything nice and linear like this, it'll be 50%. A couple of easy things to point out, right? Fixed cost savings sometimes matter a great deal in antitrust analysis and sometimes don't. Now, with fixed cost savings, it's not a marginal cost reduction, and so the short run pass-through rate 0. Lots of discussion about what to do with fixed costs in the antitrust context because over some time horizon, all these fixed costs become variable, and we should think about them just like we thought about that marginal cost reduction. But sometimes these arguments about how long the time horizon is are subjective and sort of subject to debate. So we don't want to dismiss fixed cost savings, but often there's a discussion about how much we should think about them influencing price over the medium run, what the right time horizon for our analysis is. Okay, you'll see here's my example graphically, if you like the graphics instead of the intuition, for what happens when I get a fixed cost reduction. Right, here's a reduction where the marginal cost stays still and all that happens is fixed cost drop. When the monopolist wakes up tomorrow with lower fixed costs in the short run, it still sets MR equal to MC in the same place. I still have ultimately the same post-merger price. Short run analysis, yes. Have we increased total welfare? Yes. But if what I'm looking for is pass-through, I don't have pass-through. And there's some sort of big philosophical questions between the total welfare standard and the consumer surplus standard about how much we should count these things and over what time horizon. But for the immediate sort of introductory analytical purposes, fixed cost savings, not pass-through. Okay. Variable cost savings, you've seen before. We set MR equals to MC. What happens when MC falls? Less bad news means we increase output and reduce the price, right? You've already seen in the last example, this gets us with linear demand a 50% pass-through rate. Just not true that the post-merger, even monopoly, a sort of 2-to-1 merger, not true that the monopolist pockets it because he's a bad guy. Profit maximizes, which means he sets MR equal to MC before and after, which means we get some pass-through and price falling. How much might matter a great deal in a case, right? If I've got some real estimate of harm and I think there's going to be a price increase or a high GUPPI or sort of some evidence of a price increase, I might care a lot about the pass-through. In the larger that anti-competitive effect or predicted anti-competitive effect, the more I'm going to care about the magnitude of my rectangle of cost savings, plus the more I'm going to care about how much is passed through. That pass-through is sort of a whole nother topic. You can think about linear demand getting you a 50% pass-through rate just for sort of rough purposes, really, really rough sort of back of the envelope sketching out. But the sensitivity of pass-through to curvature in the demand curve can be really big, right? And so you can see debates over that. So this is really just to sort of set out the basics, right? And here's my 50% example with linear, and the same kind of logic gets you a 50% pass-through rate from the GUPPI to a price increase. Okay. To sum up, unilateral effects, we're focused on the incentives of the post-merger firm to increase price. We're going to do that by plugging into this profit maximizing condition, right? MR equals to MC, setting the rectangles equal. How much Is the merger going to allow the post-merger firm to internalize that recaptured diversion? The bigger that is, the larger the incentive. Right? We're using closeness of competition as opposed to market structure to make our predictions. There are some limitations of the approach, right? One limitation is the GUPPI is not going to tell us a price increase. It's going to measure the strength of the incentive. And we're going to assume away entry, efficiencies, competitive responses by the other firms in the market. That's a big one, right? If in response to a price increase, other competitors will lower price or respond in different ways to defeat the price increase, that's not captured in any of this value of diverted sales GUPPI analysis. We're going to want a lot of tools. And in later online lectures in this series, you'll see some of the econometric approaches using entry-exit experiments and other tools to sort of bolster this sort of analysis and give us other kinds of data, merger simulation, bidding data about closeness of competition between the firms, how to estimate diversion ratios. We'll sort of hone in on those and practical tools to think about these things in later lectures. But for now, we can sort of see measuring the closeness of competition, using that to get diagnostic ways to think about the likelihood of unilateral price effects. And on the flip side, thinking about how an acquisition may reduce incentives to increase price or even create incentives to decrease the price, right? So incremental cost reductions being the flip side, right? We're thinking about a firm profit maximizing before the merger, acquiring a new firm, profit maximizing after, right? That post-merger profit maximization problem might be different for two reasons, and this goes back to Williamson. Might be different because I've eliminated a competitive constraint, and so a merger may create some upward pricing pressure. Might also be different because we've got a new cost structure, right? And I can have one or both of those things going on, and our challenge really is to examine both sides of those coins and also to sort of measure appropriately when we've got both the triangle and the rectangle so we can get a decent sense of magnitudes. I'll stop there. I hope you enjoyed and look forward to seeing you in other GAI online lectures. Thanks.